The air inside the trauma room tasted like copper and gunpowder. Sloane Kincaid pressed her spine against the overturned surgical table, blood seeping hot through the field dressing on her left shoulder. Around her, the clinic walls were Swiss cheese bullet holes punched through drywall, exposing rebar and insulation. Overhead lights swung on damaged wiring, throwing epileptic shadows across six Navy SEALs fighting to stay alive in what used to be a place of healing. 72 hours into the siege. 72 hours since the first explosion. 72 hours since Sloane Kincaid had stopped being a volunteer nurse and become something she'd sworn she'd never be again. Across the debris-strewn floor, Petty Officer Garrett Hollister clutched his thigh where a cat tourniquet bit deep into muscle. The man's face had gone the color of old newsprint lips pressed white against pain. He refused to vocalize. 20 feet to Sloane's left, Seaman Wyatt Brennan convulsed on blood-slicked linoleum, his chest barely rising, hands clawing at his throat like he could rip his own airway open if he just tried hard enough. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural cavity, building pressure, crushing the lung, collapsing the heart. 4 minutes until irreversible brain damage. Maybe 6 until death. Sloane's vision blurred at the edges. Blood loss, dehydration. 3 hours of sleep spread across 3 days. Her body was screaming for rest, for surrender, for someone else to handle this impossible situation. But there was no one else. Brennan was dying right now. Hollister? Her voice cut through the staccato gunfire from outside, through the screams of wounded men, through the chaos that combat always brought. Clear, sharp, a scalpel slicing through noise. Move that tourniquet 3 inches higher, proximal to the wound, or you'll lose the leg. Hollister's hands shook, shock setting and blood loss, making him clumsy. But he obeyed. Loosened the windlass, repositioned the tourniquet closer to his hip, cranked it tight again. The agony made him gasp, made sweat break across his forehead, but the pulsing arterial bleed slowed to a controllable ooze. Good, Sloane said. Now talk to me. Count backwards from 100. Stay conscious. She pushed herself up from the wall and crawled toward Brennan. Broken glass from shattered IV bottles bit into her palms, opened fresh cuts that she didn't have time to acknowledge. Her entire world had narrowed to a single point, the young SEAL choking to death on his own collapsed lung. Gunnery Sergeant Hawk Drummond materialized at her shoulder like a ghost, 6'3", of bearded, battle-hardened operator, his face a roadmap of dust, dried blood, and 3 days without real sleep. Kincaid, you need to stop. You're running on empty and... Needle. She held out her hand, palm up, not looking at him. 14-gauge decompression needle, now. Drummond hesitated for half a heartbeat, the kind of hesitation that came from watching too many corpsmen freeze under pressure from losing men because medics couldn't handle the stress. Then he grabbed the decompression kit from the scattered medical supplies and slapped it into her palm, hard enough to sting. Sloane's fingers found the anatomical landmark on Brennan's chest with the certainty of muscle memory, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right where the trapped air would be building its fatal pressure. She'd performed this procedure 63 times in her career, 42 in actual combat, but never like this. Never while bleeding from her own wounds. Never with her hands shaking from blood loss and exhaustion. But her hands weren't shaking. They never did. She pushed the needle through skin, through the intercostal muscle, guided it between the ribs, with practiced precision until she felt the subtle pop of penetrating the pleural space. The hiss of escaping air under pressure was the most beautiful sound in the world. Brennan's chest expanded. Color flooded back into his lips from purple to pink in the span of 3 seconds. His eyes fluttered open, wild and confused but alive. There you go, Sloane whispered, her voice dropping to something almost tender. Breathe, kid. Just breathe. She pulled back and the room tilted sideways. Strong hands caught her shoulders before she could collapse. Chief Boone McKenzie, the team's senior, enlisted a 51-year-old SEAL who'd seen more combat than most people had seen birthdays. He eased her back against the wall with surprising gentleness. Easy there, Doc, McKenzie said. His voice carried the kind of gentleness that only came from watching too many young people die, from understanding exactly how close to the edge they all were. You did good, real good. Sloane looked down at her hands. They were covered in blood. Brennan's bright arterial red Hollister's, darker venous crimson, her own somewhere in the mix. The tactical gloves she'd been wearing had long since been shredded, leaving her palms exposed, cut raw. Drummond crouched in front of her, those winter-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. Who are you? He'd asked variations of this question maybe 20 times over the past 3 days. But something had shifted in his voice. Fear, maybe, or recognition. The kind of recognition that came when one operator looked at another and saw past the disguise. Who the hell are you really? The locket at Sloane's throat felt impossibly heavy. Inside it, tucked against her sternum for the past 11 years, was a photograph of a man in Army fatigue's Ranger tab on his shoulder, green beret cocked just so, smile lines crinkling around eyes that had seen too much war and still found joy in teaching his daughter to shoot. Garrett Kincaid, dead from cancer when Sloane was 19. Gone before he could see what she'd become. She could hear his voice in her head clear as if he were standing right beside her in this ruined clinic. Both hands, kiddo. Heal when you can. Fight when you must. But always, always know the difference. And I'm trying, Dad, she whispered. I'm trying to keep the promise. Her vision tunneled. The world faded to black. The last thing she heard was Drummond's voice, urgent and commanding. Mackenzie, get an IV in her. Hollister, check her wounds. We're not losing our doc. Not after everything she's done. Then nothing. 4 days earlier, dust hung in the air at the St. Augustine Humanitarian Outpost, like a living thing coating everything in a fine layer of grit, the color of old bone. The clinic sat 30 miles north of the Mexican border, in a stretch of Texas scrubland that belonged to cartels and coyotes, and people desperate enough to trust either. This was the kind of place where the law ended and survival began, where humanitarian workers came to save the world and often ended up needing saving themselves. Sloane Kincaid had been here for 18 months, long enough that the other volunteers had stopped asking questions about her past, long enough that she could almost convince herself she'd left that past behind. Almost. She stood at the supply room window in the pre-dawn light, watching the sun paint the compound walls in shades of amber and rust. The outpost was built inside the bones of an old ranch property, surrounded by 12-foot concrete barriers topped with razor wire that gleamed like broken promises in the morning light. 4 buildings formed a defensive square around a central courtyard, the main clinic, the supply depot staff quarters, and a generator shed that coughed black smoke every third day like a dying engine. Outside the walls, the desert stretched to the horizon, broken only by the 2-lane highway that connected them to civilization. That highway was their lifeline. It was also their greatest vulnerability. Sloane's eyes traced the compound perimeter, noting the guard tower's sightlines, the blind spots, where the supply building blocked the view, the 3 possible exits if everything went to hell. Her mind automatically calculated fields of fire, assessed defensive positions, identified the weak points in their security. Then she caught herself. This wasn't how nurses thought. This was how operators thought. This was the part of herself she'd buried so deep, she'd almost convinced herself it was dead. Sloane closed her eyes and counted to 5, a technique her therapist had taught her for managing the PTSD flashbacks. When she opened them again, she forced herself to see what was actually there, a medical clinic, a place of healing, not a tactical position, not a kill box waiting to happen. Sloane, we're running low on epinephrine. Dr. Fletcher Whitmore stood in the doorway, a clipboard clutched in hands that trembled with essential tremor. He was 62 years old and should have been retired teaching grandkids to fish, but instead he was here trying to save the world, one migrant family at a time, with shaky hands and an unshakable heart. I inventoried yesterday evening, doctor, Sloane said. Her voice was soft, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of voice that blended into backgrounds and was forgotten 5 minutes after you heard it. 3 boxes in the generator shed. I'll bring them in. You work too hard, Sloane. Whitmore shook his head, the tremor making the movement jerky. Night shifts, inventory, patient care. When do you sleep? Enough to function. She moved past him into the hallway. The clinic smelled like every field hospital she'd ever worked in, antiseptic, failing to quite cover the underlying scent of blood and desperation. 20 beds lined the main ward, most of them full. Dehydration cases, infected wounds from desert crossings, a woman in labor, a child with malaria brought north from Guatemala burning with fever despite the ice packs. Sloane knew every patient's chart by heart, their names, their stories, their odds of survival. It was the least she could do, the very least. She pushed through the exterior door into the building heat. The temperature was already climbing toward 90 degrees and it was barely 6 in the morning. By noon it would hit 110 and the clinic would become an oven that their struggling air conditioning could barely manage. As Sloane crossed the courtyard toward the generator shed, her eyes swept the compound. It was automatic, unconscious, the kind of threat assessment that had been drilled into her until it became as natural as breathing. 3 exits, 2 vehicles, both civilian trucks, neither armored. Sight lines from the guard tower to the main gate clear. Tower to the east wall obstructed by the supply building, creating a blind spot that... She stopped mid-stride. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how volunteer nurses thought. This was operator thinking. This was the part of herself she'd spent 5 years trying to kill. Sloane closed her eyes again, forcing herself to breathe. In for 4 counts, hold for 7, out for 8. The box breathing technique her father had taught her for managing stress on the shooting range, now repurposed for managing PTSD triggers. When she opened her eyes, she forced herself to see a compound, a clinic, a place where people came to be saved. Not a tactical position, not a battlefield waiting to happen. She made it exactly 3 more steps before the ground shook. It wasn't an earthquake. Living in cartel territory, you learn very quickly to distinguish between different types of ground shaking. This was sharp, percussive, man-made, the kind of explosion that came from shaped charges and professional demolition work. IED, the word formed in Sloane's mind before her conscious brain caught up with what was happening. Her body was already moving, already dropping into a tactical crouch, hands coming up to protect her head from debris. 30 yards away, the main gate erupted in a column of fire and black smoke. The shock wave rolled across the courtyard, hot and fierce, carrying the stench of burning diesel and scorched metal. The gate's heavy steel panels, designed to stop vehicles, designed to keep the clinic safe, twisted outward like crushed aluminum foil. Sloane didn't scream, didn't panic. Part of her, the part she'd tried so desperately to bury, was already analyzing the explosion. Professional job. Shaped charge, not simple pipe bomb. The blast pattern indicated someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who understood demolition and breaching techniques. This wasn't random cartel violence. This was tactical. This was military. Behind her, the clinic erupted in chaos. Dr. Whitmore's voice, high and frightened. "Get down, everyone, get down." Nurses screaming, patients crying out in terror. Sloane stayed in her crouch behind the generator shed, waiting. She checked her watch. 18 seconds since detonation. In her experience, 6 years of combat deployments, 42 actual engagements, a breach explosion was never solo. It was always the opening move in a larger assault. She counted to 5 in her head. Right on cue, 3 black SUVs roared through the shattered gate, their tires shredding gravel windows, tinted so dark they looked like holes cut in reality. These weren't cartel vehicles, too new, too clean, too obviously military grade. The lead vehicle screeched to a halt in front of the clinic entrance. Doors flew open. Men poured out, moving with the fluid aggression of apex predators who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Sloane recognized the gear immediately. Multicam fatigues, plate carriers, HK, 4.16 rifles with suppressors, helmet-mounted night vision, flipped up in the daylight. These weren't soldiers. These were operators. Special operations. The patch on the laid man's shoulder confirmed what she already knew in her gut. A golden trident. Navy SEALs. They were carrying someone, a man in an expensive suit, thrashing weakly, his white dress shirt soaked dark with blood that looked almost black in the harsh morning light. "Clear, move, move, move." The team leader's voice cut through the chaos like a blade command voice, the kind that could be heard over gunfire and explosions. He was a mountain of a man, 6'3" at least, with a gray-streaked beard and eyes like winter slate. "Medic, we need a surgical suite. Right fucking now." A younger SEAL, maybe 30, with the cocky bearing of someone who'd never failed at anything that mattered, sprinted toward the clinic doors. Multiple GSWs to the thorax tension. Pneumo developing. He's crashing fast. Sloane stood frozen behind the generator shed, watching the scene unfold like a movie she'd seen before. She should go inside, should help. She was a nurse and there was a dying man, and that meant she had a moral obligation to act. But helping meant exposure, meant questions, meant the careful cover she'd built over 18 months would start to crack and crumble. She looked down at her hands. Steady, calm, not even a tremor despite the adrenaline flooding her system. That was the problem, wasn't it? Normal people's hands shook during explosions, during armed incursions, during case and violence. Hers never had. A sharp, stinging sensation bloomed along her left side just above her hip. Sloane glanced down and saw that a piece of shrapnel from the gate explosion had sliced through her scrubs. The wound was deep, 3 inches long, maybe 4, and blood was already soaking through the fabric, hot against her skin. She pressed her palm against it, gritting her teeth against the pain. Not now. Of all the times for metal to find her, not now. She had 2 choices. Stay hidden in the shed and bleed. Let Dr. Whitmore handle the SEALs and their dying VIP with his shaky hands and limited trauma experience. Keep her head down. Stay safe, stay secret, stay buried, or go inside and help. If she went inside, she risked everything. These men were trained to notice details, trained to spot inconsistencies, trained to recognize their own kind no matter how well they tried to hide. From inside the clinic came a scream, high-pitched, desperate. the sound of a man drowning in his own blood while his body failed around him. Sloan thought about 3 teammates she'd lost 5 years ago. She thought about the promises she'd made to her mother, to herself, to the memory of her father. She thought about the person she'd been trying to become. She looked at the blood on her hands. Then she ripped a strip of fabric from the hem of her scrub top and tied it tight around her waist under her shirt, fashioning a makeshift pressure bandage that would stem the bleeding. Temporary, but it would hold long enough. She pushed her glasses higher on her nose, glasses she didn't actually need with plain lenses, just another part of the disguise. She tucked a few loose strands of hair back into the deliberately messy bun that hid what would otherwise be an obvious military regulation haircut. Then Sloan Kincaid walked into the chaos knowing she was about to cross a line she could never uncross. Inside the clinic, the world had narrowed to violence and necessity. The 6 SEALs had transformed the modest trauma room into a tactical command center with terrifying efficiency. 2 operators held security positions at the windows, rifles trained outward, scanning for threats. One worked the radio, his voice clipped and professional as he tried to raise their command element. The other 3 crowded around the examination table where they'd placed their casualty. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen in the corner, staring at the heavily armed men who'd invaded his clinic, his hands shaking worse than Sloan had ever seen them. The young SEAL medic Hollister, based on the name tape visible on his plate carrier, stood in the middle of the room with his hands slick with blood, trying to manage a situation that was spiraling rapidly out of his control. "Multiple GSWs," he shouted more to himself than anyone else. "Penetrating trauma to the right thorax. I need a chest tube kit. I need..." He looked around wildly, panic creeping into his professional demeanor. "Where the fuck is your chest tube kit?" Whitmore opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The old doctor was frozen, overwhelmed, useless. Sloan moved quietly to the supply cabinet. Her fingers found the correct drawer handle without her having to look, muscle memory from 1,000 supply runs in a dozen different field hospitals. She pulled out the chest tube kit and placed it on the metal tray beside Hollister with barely a sound. He didn't notice her. His focus was locked entirely on the patient, a man maybe 35 years old with soft hands and pale skin that spoke of a life spent in air-conditioned offices, not desert war zones. Rich based on the custom-tailored suit. Important based on the fact that Navy SEALs had risked their lives bringing him here. "BP's dropping," one of the other SEALs called out from his position monitoring the portable vital signs monitor. His voice was tight with stress. 80 over 40 and falling. "Hollister, you're losing him." "I know," Hollister's voice cracked, the professional veneer fracturing. "I can't get a line. His veins have completely collapsed." Sloan watched from her position by the supply cabinet. She shouldn't intervene, shouldn't reveal knowledge she wasn't supposed to have. But the patient's lips were turning blue. His chest wasn't moving right, paradoxical breathing pattern, the kind that meant his airway was compromised. His lung collapsing, his body shutting down system by system. 30 seconds until the point of no return. 25, 20. Sloan reached past a startled SEAL and opened another drawer. The intraosseous infusion kit, a medical drill used to inject fluids directly into the bone marrow when peripheral veins had collapsed. She slammed it onto the tray next to Hollister hard enough to make him jump. "Tibial access," she said. Her voice was flat, clinical, devoid of the warmth and uncertainty that characterized her normal volunteer nurse persona. "Drill into the proximal tibia. It's faster than trying to find a collapsed vein." Hollister looked up wild-eyed. He saw a small woman in dirty scrubs, maybe 5'4", couldn't weigh more than 120, with blood on her hands, looking at him with eyes that were calm and unimpressed and completely, utterly certain. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "The nurse," Sloan said. "Do you want to save him, or do you want to stand here measuring Dick's drill?" "Now." For a half second, Hollister just stared at her. Then the monitor screamed a warning: bradycardia, the patient's heart rate dropping into the danger zone. Hollister grabbed the drill. Sloan didn't wait for him to figure out the procedure. While he worked on establishing the intraosseous line, she moved to the patient's head. She'd seen what Hollister had missed in his panic, what Dr. Whitmore with his shaking hands would never have caught. The patient wasn't just shot. His airway was crushed, either from blunt trauma during the firefight or from tissue swelling compressing his trachea. It didn't matter which. What mattered was that he was suffocating, and the chest tube wouldn't do a damn bit of good if air couldn't get to his lungs in the first place. "He's not ventilating," Sloan stated. "I'm clearing the fucking chest." Hollister argued, his hands shaking as he struggled with the unfamiliar intraosseous drill. "His throat is crushed. Chest tube won't matter if he can't breathe." Sloan grabbed a scalpel from the surgical tray. "Hey," the team leader Drummond, she would learn later, stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward the sidearm holstered on his thigh. Put that down. Step away from the asset right fucking now. Sloane didn't look at the gun. She looked at the patient's face purple. Now lips the color of twilight eyes rolling back in his head as his brain began to die from oxygen deprivation. Shoot me if you want, gunnery sergeant, she said calmly, positioning the blade over the man's throat with absolute precision. But he'll be dead before the shell casing hits the floor. So you need to decide right now which outcome you want. She cut. The silence in the trauma room was absolute and terrible. Even the sounds of distant chaos outside seemed to fade. The only noise was the hiss of the portable oxygen tank and the rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor as it began slowly to climb back toward a sustainable rhythm. Sloane had performed a perfect cricothyrotomy in 11 seconds flat. She'd made the vertical incision through the cricothyroid membrane, inserted the endotracheal tube, secured the emergency airway, and connected the bag valve mask before Hollister had even finished establishing his intraosseous line. She stepped back, dropping the bloody scalpel into a metal basin. The clang of steel on steel echoed in the silent room like a bell tolling. She wiped her hands on her scrubs, right over the spot where her own shrapnel wound was throbbing like a hot coal beneath the makeshift bandage. The adrenaline was wearing off now, and the pain was becoming impossible to ignore. But her face remained neutral, showed nothing. Hollister stared at the endotracheal tube protruding from the patient's neck. The placement was textbook perfect, the kind of surgical precision that came from doing the procedure hundreds of times under the worst possible conditions. He looked up at Sloane, really looked at her for the first time. You said you're a nurse. Sloane turned to the sink and started scrubbing her hands, turning her back on a room full of armed men, a calculated risk, but one that sold the performance. Nurses wash their hands after procedures. That's what nurses did. I am. Nurses don't do cricks, Hollister said, stepping closer to her, his voice dropping low and dangerous. Not like that. Not in 11 fucking seconds with perfect placement. I worked in an ER in Detroit, Sloane lied. It was her standard cover story, memorized and rehearsed until it sounded like truth. You learn to move fast when people are dying in front of you. Drummond lowered his rifle but didn't safe it. He watched Sloane with those winter gray eyes, head tilted slightly, like a wolf studying something that didn't quite smell right. Gunnery Sergeant Hawk Drummond had been hunting bad guys for 26 years, across 5 continents and a dozen wars. He knew bone-deep instinct level, knew when something was off, when someone was hiding something. And this nurse smelled like secrets and smoke. What's your name? He asked. Sloane. She didn't offer a last name. Kept scrubbing her hands at the sink like this was just another day at work. Sloane what? Does it matter? She turned off the tap and reached for a towel, her movements deliberately calm, deliberately unremarkable. He's stable for now, but you can't keep him here. We don't have the blood reserves for major trauma. He needs a surgical team and a medevac, preferably in the next 30 minutes. Comms are jammed, Drummond said flatly. We're cut off from our command element. That explosion at the gate was the opening bell. We're expecting a second wave of hostiles any minute now. As if the universe had been listening and waiting for its cue, the radio on Drummond's chest crackled to life with a burst of static. Drummond, this is Watchtower. The voice was tense, urgent. We have movement on the eastern ridge, estimated 3 packs with heavy weapons. They're setting up what looks like a mortar pit. You need to prepare for indirect fire. Drummond's jaw clenched so hard Sloane could see the muscle jumping beneath his beard. Copy Watchtower. Keep me posted on their movements. He keyed off the radio and looked around the trauma room at his team, at the dying VIP, at the small volunteer nurse who just saved a life with the kind of precision that shouldn't exist outside of combat medical training. His team, his responsibility. And now they were trapped in a soft target aid station with no exit strategy, no air support, and a VIP who couldn't be moved. All right, lock it down, he ordered. His voice carried the weight of command, the certainty of a man who'd made impossible decisions and lived with the consequences. Hollister, keep the asset alive. Brennan Mackenzie, secure the windows and establish fields of fire. Merrick, get the Barrett set up with overwatch on that ridge. We hold this position until nightfall, then we move under darkness. The SEALs dispersed with practiced efficiency, transforming the clinic into a fortress with terrifying speed. Tables were overturned to create cover. Windows were reinforced with whatever furniture could be moved. Firing positions were established with overlapping fields of fire. And through it all, Sloane caught a glimpse of another SEAL she hadn't noticed before, Lieutenant Nash Merrick, the team's designated marksman. 38, lean and wiry, with the calm eyes of someone who'd made 100 impossible shots and expected to make 100 more. He was carrying a Barrett M82A1 like it weighed nothing, moving toward the stairs that would give him access to the clinic's second floor and a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. Their eyes met for just a second. Something flickered in Merrick's expression, recognition maybe, or just professional assessment of another person in the tactical space. Then he was gone, heading for his sniper position. Sloan moved toward the door, intending to check on the other patients to maintain her cover as the concerned volunteer nurse. "Where do you think you're going?" Hollister asked. He was watching her walk now, and she could see him noticing the slight hitch in her step, the way she was favoring her left side. "I have other patients," Sloan said, keeping her voice level. "Doctor, Whitmore is in the back with a pregnant woman in early labor and a child with malaria. Unless you're planning on shooting them too, I need to check on them." "You stay where I can see you," Drummond ordered. His voice was flat absolute. "Nobody leaves this room until I say so. For all I know, you're a liability, or worse." Sloan stopped, turned slowly. Her glasses had slid down her nose slightly. She pushed them back up with one finger. "I'm not the liability here, Gunnery Sergeant," she said quietly. "You brought a high-value target into a soft-target aid station with no exit strategy, no air support, and jammed communications. You've got maybe 20 minutes before that mortar crew on the ridge gets their range dialed in. And when they do this north wall," she gestured to the cinder block construction that formed one wall of the trauma room, "is going to come down. It's not reinforced concrete. It's cinder block and hope. One direct hit and the roof collapses on your asset." The room went dead silent. Every SEAL in the space stopped what they were doing to stare at her. Nobody spoke to Drummond like that. Nobody. Drummond walked up to her. He towered over her by almost a foot, his presence enormous and intimidating, in a way that would have made most people step back. Sloan didn't move. He leaned down until his face was inches from hers. "You got a mouth on you, Sloan." "I have a brain too," she countered, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I suggest you use yours. That mortar crew is going to start walking rounds in. They'll use the gate explosion as their ranging point, then adjust fire. 10 minutes, maybe 15. When they hit this wall, people die, including your asset, including your team. Is that the outcome you want?" Drummond stared at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up and looked at the north wall. She was right. Of course she was right. The construction was obviously weak compared to the reinforced sections. "How do you know about structural integrity under fire?" he asked, his suspicion deepening with every word she spoke. "I live here, Gunnery Sergeant," Sloan said. "I know which walls keep the wind out and which ones crumble. It's part of survival in cartel country." She walked away before he could ask more questions, heading toward the supply corner where Dr. Whitmore was cowering with the civilian patients praying. He wouldn't look too closely, wouldn't see through the disguise she'd maintained for 18 months. Hollister watched her go. Then he walked over to Drummond, his voice low. "Boss," Hollister said quietly, "did you see her hands?" "Yeah," Drummond grunted, "steady as stone." "No, not just steady," Hollister said, watching Sloan's retreating form. "No wasted movement. Perfect economy of motion. And when that blast hit the gate earlier, I saw her from the truck while we were rolling in. She didn't flinch. She didn't panic. She checked her fucking watch like she was timing the breach." Drummond looked at the small woman now organizing bandages in the corner with the kind of precision that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. "Keep an eye on her, Hollister," he said quietly. "If she makes a move for a radio, for a phone, for any kind of communications device, you put her down. She might be a spotter for whoever's out there. Might be how they knew to hit us." Hollister nodded slowly, but even as he acknowledged the order, something didn't sit right. Spotters didn't save the lives of the people they were hunting. Spotters didn't perform combat medicine like they'd been doing it their whole lives. He walked over to where Sloan was sorting through IV bags, organizing them by type and expiration date with methodical efficiency. He stood close to her, close enough to smell the antiseptic soap on her hands. Close enough to smell something else underneath it. Iron. The distinctive metallic scent of fresh blood. Hollister looked down at the floor where Sloan was standing. As he watched, a small, dark drop of blood fell from beneath the hem of her scrub top and hit the linoleum with a soft pat. Drip. His eyes widened. He looked at her waist, really looked, and saw that the fabric of her scrubs was darker than it should be. Wet. "You're hit," he said quietly, reaching out toward her arm. Sloan stiffened like she'd been electrocuted. She placed a box of gauze on the shelf with exaggerated care and turned to look at him. Her eyes behind those unnecessary glasses were cold. "I'm fine. You're bleeding. Let me... Don't touch me." The venom in her voice was sudden and terrifying. It wasn't the voice of a volunteer nurse. It wasn't even the voice of a scared civilian. It was the voice of a cornered predator, of someone who'd been trained to respond to threats with overwhelming violence. Hollister raised his hands, immediately backing up half a step. Easy, I'm a medic. You're bleeding out. If you pass out from blood loss, you're useless to me and you're useless to your patients. Sloane looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then something shifted in her eyes. She saw the genuine concern there, saw that he was asking as a healer, not as a threat. It's just a scratch, she said, her voice softer now but still guarded. Let me be the judge of that, Hollister said firmly. Sit down. Let me look at it. He guided her to a stool behind a privacy curtain, away from the other SEAL's line of sight. Sloane sat, and despite her best efforts to hide it, she winced as the movement pulled at the wound. Lift your shirt, Hollister said, his voice dropping into professional medic mode. Sloane hesitated for just a second. Then she slowly raised the hem of her scrub top. Hollister inhaled sharply. It wasn't a scratch. A jagged piece of shrapnel, maybe 3 inches long, wicked sharp, was still embedded in the oblique muscle just above her hip. The makeshift tourniquet she'd fashioned from her scrub hem was completely soaked through with blood. The skin around the wound was angry purple, the beginning of serious infection setting in. Jesus Christ, Sloane, Hollister whispered, his professional detachment cracking. You performed a surgical cricothyrotomy with this in your side. You should be in shock. You should be unconscious. Pain is information, Sloane recited automatically. It was a mantra from another life, from training she wasn't supposed to have. The moment the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. She bit her lip, cursing herself internally for the slip. Hollister froze. He looked up from the wound, his blue eyes locking onto hers with sudden laser-focused intensity. That's a SEAL saying, he said slowly, carefully, like he was diffusing a bomb with his words. We learned that in BUD/S Week 4. Pain is weakness leaving the body. Pain is information. Hell Week mantras. Sloane cursed silently. She was slipping. The blood loss was making her sloppy, making her forget which version of herself she was supposed to be presenting to the world. I read it on a bumper sticker. She deflected the lie, smooth and practiced. Just patch it up, medic. We don't have time for a full interrogation. Hollister didn't believe her, not for a single second, but he began to clean the wound anyway, his movements gentle but efficient, the touch of someone who'd done this 1,000 times under worse conditions. You have shrapnel fragments against the iliac crest, he said, falling back into professional assessment. I need to extract them. It's going to hurt like hell. No way around it. Then do it, Sloane said flatly. I can give you morphine. We've got no drugs, Sloane said instantly, automatically. I need a clear head. Hollister paused in his work, looked at her again. Everything about this woman was wrong. The pain tolerance was wrong. The calm under fire was wrong. The medical knowledge was wrong. The tactical awareness was wrong. Everything screamed operator, not nurse. Okay, he said slowly. On 3. 1, 2, on 2. Without warning, he yanked the largest piece of shrapnel free. Sloane didn't scream, didn't cry out. She just exhaled sharply through her nose, her hand gripping the edge of the stool so hard the metal began to bend under the pressure. Hollister dropped the bloody shrapnel into a kidney dish with a wet clink. He looked at the bent metal of the stool where her hand had been, looked at Sloane, who was pale but breathing steadily, her eyes clear, despite what had to be extraordinary pain. Who are you really? He asked quietly, packing the wound with a combat gauze. Because I know for an absolute fact that the ER in Detroit doesn't teach you how to eat pain like that. You didn't even sweat. Your pupils didn't dilate. That's not normal human physiology. That's training. Advanced training. Sloane looked at him. Her eyes were tired behind the fake glasses, tired from 18 months of hiding, from 5 years of running, from carrying the weight of 3 dead teammates whose names she whispered to herself every night before sleep. I'm the woman who's going to save your life when those mortars start falling, she whispered. Now bandage me up, Lieutenant. The show's about to start. As if the universe had been listening and waiting for its cue, the first mortar whistle shrieked through the air. Then the world exploded into fire and chaos, and everything Sloane Kincaid had been running from for the past 5 years. The mortar round hit the east wall with the sound of God's fist punching through reality. Concrete dust billowed through the trauma room in choking clouds thick enough to drown in. The overhead fluorescent lights died with a shower of sparks. Emergency battery lamps kicked in a heartbeat later, bathing everything in a hellish red glow that made the blood on the floors look black. Sloane threw herself over the pregnant woman cowering in the corner, using her own body as a shield. Debris rained down, chunks of ceiling tile fragments, of shattered light fixtures, pieces of the building itself trying to kill them all. A chunk of concrete the size of her fist struck her bandaged shoulder, and she felt something tear. Felt fresh blood begin to seep through Hollister's careful work. The shelling continued. 3 rounds. 5. 8. They were walking the mortars and adjusting their aim with the kind of terrifying precision that spoke of professional military training, not just cartel gunmen with surplus weapons. Each impact was closer than the last. Status? Drummond's voice cut through the chaos like a chainsaw through fog. East wall is compromised. Mackenzie called from his position near the window, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Major structural damage. They're ranging us. Next volley's going to be direct hits. Sloan helped the pregnant woman to her feet, guided her with firm hands toward the interior hallway where the walls were thicker, where there was at least a chance of survival if the building came down around them. Take them to the X-ray room, she told Dr. Whitmore, who stood frozen with a crying child clutched against his chest. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold on to the boy. Lead-lined walls. It's the safest place in the building. Whitmore nodded mutely, too terrified to question how a volunteer nurse would know which room offered the best protection against indirect fire. Another mortar screamed in the whistle, building to a shriek. This one struck the north wall, exactly where Sloan had predicted 15 minutes ago. The cinder block construction, never meant to withstand this kind of punishment, crumbled like sand. A massive section of wall collapsed inward, opening the hallway to the desert beyond in a cloud of dust and destruction. Through the dust and smoke, shapes moved. Breach, rear. Breach, Brennan shouted from his window position, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Sloan saw them. 3 men in civilian clothes, faces wrapped in traditional keffiyehs, AK-47s raised and ready. They weren't military, weren't trained operators like the SEALs, but they had numbers. They had surprise. And they had absolutely nothing to lose. Hollister drew his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, and sprinted toward the breach, leaving his patient covered by sandbags and hope. Sloan didn't think, didn't calculate odds or consider consequences. Her body moved on pure instinct, following him into what every tactical manual would call the fatal funnel. She reached the hallway just as Hollister engaged the first 2 attackers. 2 controlled double-tap center mass, the shooting fundamentals drilled into every SEAL until they became reflexive. The first attacker dropped dead before he hit the ground. The second stumbled backward, mortally wounded, but not quite dead yet. The third man raised his rifle, leveling it at Hollister's head with grim certainty. The SEAL's weapon was empty, slide locked back on an empty magazine. He fumbled for a fresh one, his hands slick with blood, making the manipulation clumsy. Too slow. They both knew it. Sloan didn't have a gun. She'd promised herself 5 years ago, sworn on her father's grave, made a binding vow to her mother that she would never touch a weapon again, that she would spend the rest of her life healing instead of harming. But the hallway had once been a supply corridor, and someone had left a heavy stainless steel IV pole leaning against the wall. Sloan grabbed it. Not like a baseball bat, not swinging wildly like a panicked civilian would. Like a spear. Like a weapon she'd trained with in combatives courses she wasn't supposed to remember. The attacker's finger tightened on the trigger. Sloan moved. She drove the blunt end of the IV pole into the man's throat with surgical precision, targeting the exact spot just beneath the chin where the trachea was most vulnerable. Fast enough to surprise, precise enough to be effective, just enough force to collapse the windpipe without causing instant death, giving him 30 seconds or so to contemplate his choices while his brain slowly starved for oxygen. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as the man collapsed, his hands clawing desperately at his crushed throat, making wet gurgling sounds that Sloan had heard too many times before. Hollister stared at the man dying on the floor. He was dying the exact same way David Ashford had been dying 20 minutes ago, choking, desperate, unable to breathe. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Sloan stepped over the dying man without looking back. Her eyes found Hollister's. Her fake glasses were gone now, lost somewhere in the explosion and chaos. Her eyes, unobstructed for the first time, were cold, calculating, empty of the warmth and compassion that nurses were supposed to carry like armor against the world's cruelty. "You're out of position, medic," she said. Her voice cut through the distant gunfire like a scalpel through flesh. "Get back to your patient before he codes." Hollister just stared at her, at the body on the floor, at the 4th pole in her hands now slick with blood, at the woman who'd just executed a trained kill with the precision of someone who'd done it before and would do it again if necessary. That hadn't been a panicked defensive move. That had been a trained neutralization, a killing strike delivered with the anatomical knowledge of a surgeon and the ruthless efficiency of a Tier 1 operator. "The structure over the civilians is compromised," Sloan continued, ignoring his shock with clinical detachment. We need to move them to the X-ray room immediately. Lead-lined walls. It's the safest spot we have left. She moved past him into the supply closet where Whitmore huddled with the pregnant woman and the malaria-stricken child. Up, she ordered. Not gentle, not the soft-spoken volunteer nurse who'd worked here for 18 months. This was command voice, the voice of someone used to being obeyed in life or death situations, someone who'd given orders under fire and expected them to be followed without question. Move now. Whitmore scrambled to his feet, terrified by the transformation in his quiet assistant. Sloan grabbed the pregnant woman by the arm, hauling her to her feet with surprising strength for someone her size. Hollister, take the child. Hollister, still reeling from what he'd just witnessed, holstered his weapon and scooped up the feverish boy. He followed Sloan through the smoke-filled corridors toward the X-ray room, watching the way she moved. Not hurried, not panicked, tactical, efficient, like she'd run these kinds of evacuations 100 times before in a dozen different war zones. They had just secured the heavy lead door of the X-ray room behind the civilians when another massive explosion rocked the front of the clinic, louder than the mortars. A different sound signature entirely. RPG, rocket-propelled grenade. Then silence from the main trauma room. Absolute, terrible silence. Hollister keyed his radio with shaking hands. Drummond, Mackenzie, Brennan, Merrick, sitrep. Static hissed back at him. Nothing else. He looked at Sloan. For the first time since this whole nightmare had started, he saw something like genuine concern flicker across her face. Not fear, he suspected this woman didn't know how to be afraid anymore. But concern, the kind that came from knowing exactly what silence after an explosion usually meant. Stay here with the civilians, Hollister said, hefting his rifle with hands that were steadier, now muscle memory and training overriding the adrenaline. Guard this door. I'm going to check on the team. Sloan shook her head slowly, reached up and pulled the pins from her deliberately messy bun with calm, practiced movements. Dark hair tumbled down around her shoulders, framing a face that was suddenly much harder, much older than Hollister had realized. No, she said simply. You stay. You're the medic. If they're hurt, they're going to need someone who can treat them. Someone they trust. And what exactly are you planning to do? Hollister demanded, his voice rising slightly. You're unarmed, you're wounded, and you're supposedly a civilian volunteer nurse. Sloan walked over to the dead attacker lying in the hallway, the one she'd killed with the IV pole. She bent down and pried the AK-47 from his stiffening fingers with practiced ease. She checked the magazine muscle memory, guiding her hands through movements she'd performed thousands of times, racked the charging handle to chamber around, and slung the weapon over her shoulder with the fluid grace of someone for whom a rifle was as natural as breathing. Every single movement was textbook, professional. The kind of weapon handling that couldn't be faked, couldn't be learned from movies or YouTube videos. She turned back to Hollister. The transformation was complete. Whatever mask she'd been wearing for the past 18 months had finally irrevocably shattered. The nurse was dead. Something else stood in her place. I told you, Lieutenant, she said coldly, her voice carrying none of the softness it had held before. I'm going to save your life. Now stay here and protect the civilians. That's an order. She moved toward the silence in the main trauma room. Not like a volunteer nurse stumbling into danger, but like a Tier 1 operator entering a known fatal funnel with full tactical awareness. Hollister watched her go, his mind trying and failing to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. He'd been wrong about her. They'd all been wrong. The question was, who or what had they actually let into their perimeter? The main trauma room was an abattoir bathed in red emergency lighting. The RPG had struck the reinforced door, directly blowing it completely off its hinges. The heavy steel panel now lay twisted and bent in the middle of the room like a piece of modern art sculpted from violence. Smoke hung in thick layers, making it hard to see more than 10 feet in any direction. Small fires burned where oxygen tanks had been ruptured by shrapnel. The emergency lights flickered epileptically, giving everything a strobe-lit quality that made the scene feel surreal, nightmarish. Sloan sliced the pie around the doorframe with practiced precision, leading with the barrel of the captured AK-47. Her movements were textbook CQB, close quarter, battle the kind taught in advanced courses to special operations units. Tight, controlled, minimizing her exposure while maximizing her field of view. Each movement economical, efficient, betraying thousands of hours of training. She processed the scene in layers the way she'd been taught. Bodies first. Chief Mackenzie was down near the east window, unconscious, a spreading pool of blood beneath his head from what looked like a serious scalp wound. Seaman Brennan was slumped against the far wall, dazed, his helmet askew, blood trickling from his nose and ears. classic signs of concussive blast trauma. Gunnery Sergeant Drummond lay flat on his back in the center of the room. A massive chunk of ceiling debris, maybe 200 pounds of concrete and rebar, lay across his chest. He wasn't moving. And there, near the stairwell that led to the second-floor sniper position, was Lieutenant Nash Merrick. The team's designated marksman lay on his side, his right shoulder a mess of torn flesh and shattered bone. The Barrett M8201 he'd been carrying lay a few feet away, its scope shattered by the same shrapnel that had destroyed his shooting arm. David Ashford, the VIP, the reason for all of this, was somehow still on the table, still breathing. The ventilator continued its rhythmic hiss, oblivious to the carnage surrounding it. Sloan moved into the room with tactical precision. She didn't rush to check pulses, didn't let emotion or urgency override protocol. She cleared the fatal corners first, the places where an enemy could be hiding, waiting to ambush anyone who came through the door. The enemy had blown the door, but they hadn't entered yet. They were regrouping outside, waiting for the dust to settle before finishing the job. She had maybe 90 seconds before the next assault wave. "Status?" she whispered, kneeling beside Brennan. The young SEAL blinked, trying to focus. His pupils were different sizes, the left noticeably larger than the right. "Definite concussion. Possibly worse." "Stay down," she ordered, pressing his own rifle back into his trembling hands. "Cover the door. Anything comes through that isn't Hollister, you shoot it. Understand?" Brennan nodded slowly, his movements sluggish but compliant. Mackenzie next. The scalp wound looked dramatically worse than it actually was. Head wounds always bled like hell, made everything look like a horror movie even when the actual injury was survivable. But his carotid pulse was strong and regular. She slapped him across the face hard enough to sting. "Chief, wake up. I need you functional." Mackenzie's eyes fluttered open. "What the fuck?" "Concussion protocol. Your combat ineffective for now. Stay behind cover and try not to pass out again." She moved to Merrick next. The sniper was unconscious, his face pale from blood loss. The shoulder wound was catastrophic. She could see exposed bone through the torn flesh, could see the way his arm hung at an unnatural angle. His shooting arm. His career, possibly his life, hanging by threads. But he was breathing. Heart rate elevated, but steady. He'd live if she could stop the bleeding. She pulled a tourniquet from her own makeshift medical pouch. She'd been carrying basic trauma supplies on her person since the first explosion, some instinct telling her she'd need them, and applied it high and tight on Merrick's upper arm. "Sorry, Lieutenant," she murmured as she cranked it down. "This is going to hurt like hell when you wake up, but you'll still have an arm." Finally, Drummond, she checked his carotid artery first. Strong pulse. He was just knocked unconscious from the blast impact on his body armor. She shoved the debris off his chest with strength that belied her small frame, then slapped his face hard. Twice. "Gunny, wake up. I need you." Drummond sputtered awake, his eyes wild and unfocused. He tried to sit up, groaning as his ribs protested the movement. "What, where? Easy," Sloan said, helping him into a sitting position. "You took a blast wave to the chest, probably cracked a few ribs. You're going to feel like shit for a week, but you'll live." Drummond focused on her, saw the AK-47 slung across her chest, saw the way she was scanning the windows with tactical precision, saw the way she held herself, the posture, the awareness, the absolute lack of civilian panic. The realization hit him like a second explosion. "You," he rasped, his voice rough from dust and smoke. "You're not a fucking nurse." "I'm the person who's keeping you alive right now," Sloan said flatly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "So I suggest you listen carefully, Gunnery Sergeant. Here's your tactical situation. Your team is combat ineffective. 2 wounded, 1 concussed, 1 unconscious. You're down your designated marksman. You're out of heavy weapons ammunition. And the enemy knows you're hurt. They're going to stack up outside that door and come through in the next 60 to 90 seconds for a final assault. If we stay in this room, we all die." Drummond struggled to his knees, shaking his head to clear the fog of unconsciousness. "Hollister. Where the fuck is Hollister?" "Secure with the civilians in the X-ray room. I left him in reserve to protect the non-combatants." Drummond looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since this whole nightmare had begun. He saw the shrapnel bandage on her side soaked through with blood. He saw the absolute lack of fear in her posture, the way she held the rifle like it was an extension of her own body. He saw the cold calculation in her eyes, the tactical awareness that could only come from years of combat experience. He'd served alongside Delta Force operators. With SAS, with the best killers the civilized world had ever produced, and he recognized the scent of his own kind. "Who are you with?" Drummond demanded, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "CIA, DIA. Some black program I've never heard of. Does it matter right now? Sloan checked the magazine in her AK-47 with practiced efficiency. 70% full, maybe 21 rounds. Not enough for a sustained firefight. We can do the whole interrogation dance later. Right now, we need to move these casualties and that VIP before the building comes down on top of us. Drummond's tactical mind, still sharp despite the concussion, processed the situation. She was right. The room was compromised. Staying here was suicide. We hold our ground, he said, falling back on training and doctrine. We don't leave the asset. Sloan turned on him, her eyes blazing with something that might have been anger or might have been desperation. You hold here, you die here. The asset dies with you. They have mortars, Drummond. They're going to keep dropping rounds on this building until there's nothing left but rubble and corpses. Is that the outcome you want? We can't move him, Drummond argued, gesturing toward Ashford on the ventilator, his voice carrying the frustration of a man trapped between bad options and worse ones. We don't have a choice. But before either of them could act, before they could even begin to formulate a plan, voices began shouting outside the shattered walls. Spanish rapid fire getting closer with every syllable. 30 meters out, maybe less. Sloane's hand moved to her ear, and for the first time Drummond noticed the small, flesh-colored device tucked into her ear canal. An encrypted communications earpiece, military grade. The device crackled to life. Wraith, this is Sentinel. The voice was professional American, carrying the clipped precision of a military communications officer. We have eyes on your position via satellite. QRF is inbound from forward operating base to Streer. ET, 12 minutes. Can you hold that long? 12 minutes. An eternity in a firefight. A lifetime when you were wounded and running on empty. Sloan keyed the microphone that Drummond now saw was embedded in her collar, so small, so perfectly disguised, that he'd never noticed it. Negative, Sentinel. We have maybe 3 minutes before enemy overruns this position. I need immediate fire support. Danger close. Wraith, you're in a civilian medical facility. We cannot authorize offensive fires on... Then I'm taking tactical command of this operation. Sloan interrupted, her voice going cold and hard. Authorization code Zulu 9 Osiris. I'm invoking emergency combat authority. Get me an attack helicopter with gun run capability on these coordinates, or everyone in this building dies. That includes a United States Senator's son. Is that clear enough for you? A pause. Then stand by, Wraith. Confirming authorization. Drummond stared at her like she'd just sprouted a second head. Who the fuck are you talking to, and what the hell is Wraith? The people who are going to save all of our asses, Sloan said, her attention already shifting back to the tactical situation. Now get your team up and mobile. We've got maybe 3 minutes to move the asset to a more defensible position before they turn this place into a free fire zone. But the enemy wasn't going to give them 3 minutes. The windows shattered inward as automatic weapons fire raked across the trauma room. Sloan dove behind the overturned surgical table, rolling smoothly into cover like she'd practiced the movement 10,000 times. Drummond rolled in the opposite direction, grabbing his rifle muscle memory, overriding his concussion. Through the smoke and muzzle flash, figures began pouring through the breached north wall. Not 3 this time, not 5. A full assault element, 8, 10, maybe more. And these weren't the same poorly trained gunmen from before. These men moved with purpose, with coordination, with the kind of tactical discipline that spoke of military training. Mercenaries, Sloan's mind supplied. Former military, probably Blackwater or one of the other private military contractors that had proliferated after the Iraq and Afghanistan drawdowns. This wasn't cartel sicarios anymore. This was professional soldiers doing professional soldier work. Sloan raised the AK-47 and began to engage targets. Her shooting was clinical, precise, controlled bursts of 2 or 3 rounds, each aimed at center mass. The way she'd been trained in a career she wasn't supposed to have. 2-round shift, acquire next target, 2-round shift. Breathing steady, heart rate controlled, every shot deliberate. 3 attackers dropped in the first 6 seconds. The rest scattered for cover, their assault temporarily disrupted by unexpectedly effective resistance. Drummond, from his position behind the overturned desk, stared at her shooting stance. Perfect isosceles, perfect sight alignment, perfect trigger control. She was shooting a beat-to-hell AK-47 she'd picked up 5 minutes ago, like it was a precision instrument she'd been training with for years. Covering fire, Sloan shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Drummond, get the asset. Mackenzie, help him if you can. Brennan, your rear guard, move. She was giving orders. To a gunnery sergeant. To Navy SEALs who'd been operating together for years. And despite every protocol, Despite every regulation, despite everything they'd been trained to do, they followed them. Because in that moment, in that burning smoke-filled trauma room, Sloane Kincaid wasn't a volunteer nurse anymore. She wasn't even pretending to be one. She was an operator. And operators recognized their own. They moved as a cohesive unit, Drummond and Mackenzie dragging Ashford's gurney toward the interior hallway, the ventilator's power cord trailing behind them like an umbilical. Brennan, still concussed but functional enough to shoot, laid down suppressing fire toward the breach. And Sloane covered their retreat, her captured AK-47 barking in short, precise bursts that kept the enemy pinned behind cover. But Merrick, the unconscious sniper with the destroyed shoulder. Sloane couldn't leave him, wouldn't leave him, not after surviving this long. She grabbed Merrick's drag handle, the reinforced loop on the back of his plate carrier, designed exactly for this purpose, and began pulling him toward the hallway. He was lean and wiry, but dead weight was heavy, and her shoulder wound was screaming with every movement. She gritted her teeth and pulled harder. They made it to the X-ray room where Hollister stood guard, his eyes going wide as he saw Sloane dragging an unconscious SEAL while shooting one-handed at pursuing enemies. What the actual fuck? Shut up and barricade this door. Sloane snapped, her professional demeanor cracking for just a moment. Now, Lieutenant, move your ass. They shoved medical equipment against the heavy lead door. It wouldn't hold long. Nothing would against determined attackers with explosives, but it would buy them time. Time was all they needed. Sloane's earpiece crackled again. Wraith, this is Viper 2-1. We are inbound to your position 30 seconds out. I need you to mark your location with smoke. Red smoke for friendlies, any other color is hostile. How copy? Sloane reached into the vest of one of the dead attackers. She'd grabbed it earlier, always thinking 3 steps ahead, and pulled out a smoke grenade. Red. Lucky. She popped the pin and tossed it through the small X-ray room window that looked out onto the compound. Red smoke deployed, she transmitted. Everything outside that smoke is hostile. You are cleared hot. Danger close. I say again, danger close. The sound came first, the deep thrumming roar of helicopter rotors getting louder with every heartbeat. Then the world outside the window erupted into violence that dwarfed everything that had come before. A Viper attack helicopter's 20mm chain gun, firing 750 rounds per minute, sounded like the world tearing itself apart at the seams. The sound was physical, pressure wave that you felt in your chest and bones as much as heard. The attackers outside didn't stand a chance. Didn't even have time to run. The firing lasted maybe 15 seconds. Then silence, terrible, absolute silence, broken only by the fading sound of rotor wash. Sloane slumped against the wall, her captured AK-47 finally lowering. The adrenaline that had been sustaining her for the past hour was draining away fast, leaving only exhaustion and pain in its wake. Drummond stood in front of her, blocking the door with his considerable bulk. His face was hard, unreadable. You're going to tell me who you are. Right the fuck now. No more deflections, no more lies. Sloane met his gaze without flinching. She reached up with one hand and touched the locket at her throat, the one piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to keep. Inside, she knew, was a photograph of a man in army fatigues. Garrett Kincaid, her father. Dead 11 years from cancer that the VA had refused to treat until it was too late. My name is Sloane Kincaid, she said quietly, her voice carrying exhaustion and resignation in equal measure. I was a Navy corpsman attached to Marine Force Recon. 6 years of active service. Medical designation, but I was cross-trained in forward observation combat operations and advanced marksmanship. Bullshit, Hollister said flatly. Corpsmen don't shoot like that. Some of us did, Sloane said. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless, the way it always did when she talked about her past. My father was an Army Ranger instructor at Fort Benning. He taught me to shoot from the time I was 11 years old. By the time I was 16, I could put 5 rounds into a 2-inch group at 600 meters. By 18, I was shooting competitively at the national level. Why hide it? Mackenzie asked, his voice gentle despite the chaos around them. The old chief had seen enough war to recognize a wounded soul when he saw one. Because 5 years ago, I watched 3 of my teammates die in front of me, Sloane said, her voice cracking for the first time. We got sent into an ambush because some fucking intelligence officer at command got his intel from a source who was playing both sides. Bad information, compromised mission. My team leader, my best friend, and a kid who'd been in country for exactly 9 days, all of them died while I tried to save them. She looked down at her hands, still steady, still covered in blood. I tried everything. Tourniquets, hemostatic agents, needle decompressions, but you can't tourniquet a severed carotid artery. You can't patch a sucking chest wound when someone's taken a burst from a PKM machine gun at 20 meters. You can't bring back the dead no matter how good your training is. The room was silent except for Ashford's ventilator and the distant sound of more helicopters approaching. I got medically discharged for PTSD 6 months later, Sloan continued. Made a promise to my mother at my father's grave. No more war, no more killing, no more putting myself in situations where I'd have to watch people I cared about die. Just healing from that point forward. That's why I'm here. That's why I've been hiding. Because every time I pick up a rifle, I see their faces. Hollister was the first to speak. Sloan, you saved our lives, all of us. Every single person in this room is breathing because of you. I broke my promise. Sloan whispered, tears finally beginning to track through the dust and blood on her face. I swore I'd never touch a weapon again. Never kill again. And today Her voice broke completely. You kept a bigger promise, Mackenzie said, his weathered face gentle with understanding. The promise every medic makes, every corpsman, every person who chooses this path. First, do no harm, but also protect those who cannot protect themselves. You did both today. The heavy lead door burst open with enough force to scatter the medical equipment they'd piled against it. A 12-man Marine Force reconnaissance security team flooded into the room, weapons raised, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of thousands of hours of training. They wore full combat gear and moved like they owned the battlefield. Behind them came medical personnel in flight suits carrying a proper field stretcher for Ashford, advanced life support equipment that made the clinic's supplies look medieval by comparison. And behind them, walking like he owned not just the battlefield but the whole damn world, came a man in his mid-50s wearing a flight suit with Rear Admiral stars on the collar. Rear Admiral Thorne, Naval Special Warfare Command. Sloan stood swaying slightly from blood loss and exhaustion. Thorne caught her arm, steadying her with a grip that was firm but not painful. Corpsman Kincaid, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and something else, respect maybe, or satisfaction. It's been a long time. 3 years if I'm counting correctly. Sloan's blood went cold despite the desert heat bleeding through the broken walls. Sir, we've been watching you, Sloan, Thorne said quietly, so only she could hear over the controlled chaos of the medical evacuation happening around them. Did you really think we just let one of our best operators disappear into the civilian world? You were placed at St. Augustine specifically because we knew cartel activity was increasing in this sector. We knew that eventually you'd be needed, and we were right. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. You used me. You manipulated me into... I gave you a purpose. Thorne interrupted, his voice hardening. You were rotting away in guilt and survivor's remorse, wasting your talents on volunteer work that any first-year nursing student could do. I put you somewhere you could make a real difference, and look what you did. You saved 8 lives today, including the son of a United States senator. He gestured toward Ashford being loaded onto the field stretcher. Wait. Sloan's mind caught up with what he'd said, pushing through the fog of exhaustion and blood loss. Senator's son, I thought he was some kind of contractor, or David Ashford, Thorne said, his expression darkening considerably. Senator Robert Ashford's only child. And according to the intelligence we've been gathering, while you were busy playing hero, he set up his own kidnapping. Planned to ransom himself for $3 million and split the money with the cartel. The fucking idiot didn't realize they planned to kill him the moment they got paid. Sloan's world tilted slightly. She stared at the unconscious man she'd saved, the man she'd broken every promise to save, the man for whom she'd killed and bled and sacrificed the peace she'd been trying to build. A traitor, a criminal, a fool who'd orchestrated his own kidnapping for money. But before she could process this information, before she could even begin to unpack what it meant, Ashford's eyes fluttered open. He was still heavily sedated, still delirious from the trauma and drugs, and he looked directly at Sloan without any recognition of the woman who'd saved his life. Did they, he muttered, his words slurred but audible. Did they get the money, $3 million? They promised me half, just had to come here, get captured, split the ransom. Easy money. The words hit the room like a grenade. Sloan grabbed his phone from the pile of confiscated belongings, unlocked it, no password, the idiot hadn't even secured his device. Opened his messages. Encrypted messaging app, dozens of conversations, all with the same number, a Sinaloa area code. She scrolled through them, her expression getting darker with every message. When you arrive at the clinic, my men will create a situation. Make it look real. The SEALs will try to protect you. Let them. It makes the kidnapping more believable. 3 days, that's all you need to hold out. Then we get paid, you get your cut. Everyone walks away. Son of a bitch, Drummond breathed, reading over her shoulder. We're dying to save a fucking traitor. Merrick lost his shooting arm for this piece of shit. Hollister's face had gone white with rage. 8 men bled, 3 are wounded. One might never shoot again. For a criminal who set us up. The team's energy shifted dramatically. Rage barely controlled the kind of anger that came from betrayal, from being used, from sacrificing for someone who didn't deserve it. Doesn't matter, Sloan said quietly but with absolute conviction. Every head in the room turned to stare at her. What? Drummond's voice was dangerous. It doesn't matter what kind of person he is, Sloan said, meeting Drummond's eyes without flinching. We save him anyway, because that's the job. Because if we start making decisions about who deserves to live based on who they are or what they've done, we're not healers anymore, we're executioners. We're the same as the people we're supposed to be better than. She looked at each of them in turn, Drummond, Hollister, Mackenzie Brennan, even the unconscious Merrick being loaded onto a stretcher. I killed 2 men today. Maybe more. I don't know if all my shots in the trauma room were fatal. I broke every promise I made to myself, to my mother, to my father's memory. And you know what? I'd do it again. Not for him. She gestured toward Ashford with contempt. But for you, for the innocent civilians, for the pregnant woman and the sick child, for everyone who couldn't protect themselves. It was the hardest thing she'd ever said, and she meant every single word. Admiral Thorne stepped closer, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of command. Come back, Sloan. The Navy needs operators like you. Hell, all of special operations needs people who can do what you do. Medical expertise combined with tactical proficiency. You're too valuable to waste. Sloan pulled her arm from his grip, though the movement cost her, made her shoulder wound bleed fresh. She looked at Drummond and his team, at the men she'd fought beside, bled beside, nearly died beside. No, sir, she said firmly. I'm a corpsman. That's what I am. That's what I've always been. And corpsmen heal. That's our purpose, our calling. You're more than that, Thorne insisted. Maybe, Sloan acknowledged, but I get to choose what I do with it. And I choose healing, always healing. The fighting, she looked at the rifle still slung across her shoulder, that's only when there's no other choice left. She swayed again, and this time her legs gave out completely. Hollister caught her before she hit the ground. Medic! He shouted, his professional training overriding everything else. She's crashing. Severe blood loss, probable internal injuries, definitely going into shock. As the Marine medics rushed over as they laid her on a stretcher and started cutting away her blood-soaked scrubs to assess the damage, Sloan's vision began to tunnel. She could hear voices, urgent, professional. The familiar sounds of trauma medicine being practiced at the highest level. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Brennan's face, pale and scared, leaning over her stretcher. Stay with us, Doc, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. You taught me how to do this. You taught me chest compressions, rescue breathing, all of it. Don't make me use it on you. Please don't make me. Sloan tried to smile. Failed. Her hand reached up, trembling, and found the locket at her throat. Both hands, kid, she whispered, her voice fading. Heal when you can. Fight when you have to, but always know the difference. Then the world went black and Sloan Kincaid finally mercifully let go. Sloan woke to the smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of a heart monitor. The ceiling above her was white, hospital white, the kind of sterile brightness that meant civilization's safety, the absence of immediate threats. Her body felt like it had been run through an industrial shredder, every muscle aching, every breath a conscious effort. She tried to sit up. A hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, pushed her back down against the pillows. Easy there, Doc, Chief Mackenzie's voice warm with relief. You've been out for 3 days. Your body needs rest. 3 days. Sloan's mind raced, trying to fill in the gaps, trying to remember what had happened after she'd collapsed. The team, everyone's fine, Mackenzie assured her quickly. We're all accounted for. Even Ashford, the traitorous son of a bitch. Though he's in federal custody now, so I doubt he's feeling particularly fine about his life choices. Sloan blinked, trying to focus. She was in a hospital room, clean, modern, with state-of-the-art medical equipment. Through the window, she could see palm trees swaying in a breeze. Where am I? Naval Medical Center, San Diego, Mackenzie said, settling back into the chair beside her bed. He looked older than she remembered, more worn. 3 days of stress had aged him. They medevaced you straight from St. Augustine. You coded twice on the flight. Brennan did CPR both times exactly the way you taught him. Brought you back both times. Sloan closed her eyes, processing this. Merrick. Shoulders bad, real bad. He's looking at multiple surgeries and probably a year of physical therapy. Might regain 80% function if he's lucky. But he's alive and he's got you to thank for that. You tourniqueted him, dragged him to safety while under fire. He knows what you did. Drummond. Cracked ribs, mild concussion, generally pissed off at the world but functional. He wanted to be here when you woke up, but he's in debriefs. They all wanted to be here. Mackenzie reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, carefully folded. The team wanted me to give you this. He handed her a patch custom-made, the kind that got stitched together by someone who cared. It showed a medical cross with a rifle cross behind it, and curved around the top were the words, "Horseman, both hands." Sloan took it with trembling fingers, staring at it for a long moment. "Drummond's idea," Mackenzie said quietly. "He said you showed us something we'd never seen before. A medic who could fight when necessary. A fighter who chose to heal when possible. Someone who understood both skill sets and knew when to use each one. That's what both hands means. You're not just one thing, you're both, and that makes you something special." Sloane's eyes burned with tears she'd been holding back for days, for months, for 5 years of running and hiding. "My mother called, didn't she?" Mackenzie nodded slowly. "Admiral Thorne notified next of kin. She knows what happened, knows you had to fight, knows you killed people." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's processing. Asked for time to think." "She must hate me," Sloane whispered. "She loves you," Mackenzie corrected gently. "And love doesn't disappear just because it gets complicated. Give her time. She'll come around." A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse poked her head in, professional and efficient. "Chief Mackenzie, visiting hours are over. Miss Kincaid needs her rest." Mackenzie stood but paused at the door, looking back. "Drummond put in a formal request to Naval Special Warfare Command. He wants you assigned to his team as their permanent corpsman. If you decided to come back—" "I'm not coming back," Sloane said automatically. "I know," Mackenzie said, and somehow that acknowledgement made it easier. "But the offer stands. You get to choose which hand to use, Sloane. Just don't forget you have both." He left, and Sloane was alone with her thoughts, her pain, and the patch that meant more than any metal ever could. She touched the locket at her throat. Her father's photograph was still inside, had survived everything. Garrett Kincaid, who'd taught his daughter to shoot because he knew the world was dangerous. Who died before seeing what she'd become. "I broke my promise, Dad," she whispered to the empty room. "But I think I kept yours. Protected people. Saved lives. Used both hands when I had to." Outside her window, the San Diego sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood red. Somewhere in this city, Drummond and his team were debriefing, reliving the 72 hours that had changed everything. Somewhere, David Ashford sat in a federal holding cell, his privileged life in ruins. Somewhere, Admiral Thorne was writing reports that would determine not just Sloane's future, but the future of how the military thought about integrated combat medical training. But in this moment, in this quiet hospital room, Sloane Kincaid was just a wounded woman trying to figure out who she was and who she wanted to be. Corpsman, operator, nurse, warrior. Maybe she was all of them. Maybe that was okay. Her eyes drifted shut, exhaustion pulling her back towards sleep. Tomorrow she'd deal with consequences. Tomorrow she'd face her mother. Tomorrow she'd make decisions about her future. Tonight she'd just rest. The patch lay on her chest over her heart. Horseman, both hands, heal when you can, fight when you must. Know the difference. She was still trying to learn that last part. 3 days later, the phone beside Sloane's bed rang. She stared at it for 6 long rings, knowing who it was, knowing this conversation could go 1,000 different ways. On the 7th ring, she answered. "Sloane." Her mother's voice, Barbara Kincaid, 60 years old, strong as steel and soft as rain. The woman who'd raised her alone after Garrett died. The woman who'd begged her not to enlist, who'd cried when she deployed, who'd made Sloane promise on her father's grave that she'd never touch a weapon again after that disastrous final mission. "Hi, Mom." Silence stretched between them like barbed wire, painful, dangerous, something that could cut if you weren't careful. "They told me what happened," Barbara finally said. Her voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when she was trying very hard not to cry or scream, or both. "Admiral Thorne called me personally, said you were a hero, said you saved 8 men, including a senator's son. Mom, he also said you killed people." The words came out, sharp, cutting. "You promised me, Sloane. You promised me on your father's grave. You swore you'd never pick up a gun again, never kill again, and you broke that promise." Sloane closed her eyes, feeling each word like a physical blow. "I know." "Then why did you do it? Why couldn't you just hide, just stay safe like you promised?" "Because 8 men would have died if I hadn't acted," Sloane said quietly, "including a 23-year-old kid who's engaged to be married, a 51-year-old chief who has grandchildren. Good men who were just trying to save someone they thought needed saving. That's not your responsibility." Barbara's composure finally cracked, her voice rising. You're a nurse, a healer. You shouldn't have to. She couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't want to, Sloane said, and now her own voice was breaking. I didn't want any of it, Mom. I wanted to stay hidden. I wanted to keep my promise. But there was a dying man in front of me, and I had the skills to save him. And then there were men trying to kill the people I just saved, and I had the skills to stop them. What was I supposed to do? Let them all die to keep a promise. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I need time, Barbara said, finally, her voice small and hurt. I need to think about this. About you. About what it means that my daughter is someone who can. A killer, Sloane offered, because the word needed to be said aloud. I was going to say a warrior, Barbara said, and there was something in her voice that Sloane couldn't quite identify. But I don't know if I can accept that. I need time. The line went dead. Sloane held the phone for a long time before setting it back in the cradle. Her mother's rejection hurt worse than any wound she'd taken at St. Augustine. Worse than the shrapnel. Worse than watching her teammates die 5 years ago. She was still staring at the ceiling, trying to process everything when Admiral Thorne walked into her room without knocking. He didn't wait for permission. Didn't ask if she was up for visitors. Just strode in wearing his service dress, blues 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, ribbons covering his chest like a history of modern warfare, and pulled up the visitor's chair like he owned not just the room but the entire hospital. Corpsman Kincaid, he said, his voice carrying the weight of command and expectation. You look like hell, but at least you're alive. Thank you, sir. Your bedside manner is truly inspiring. Thorne smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I wanted to check on you before I fly back to Norfolk. See how you're healing, physically and otherwise. Physically, I'll live. Otherwise, Sloane shook her head. Ask me in a year. Your mother called you. It wasn't a question. Of course he knew. The man probably had access to her phone records. Her medical charts probably knew what she'd had for breakfast. She needs time to process, Sloane said carefully. She needs to understand that her daughter saved 8 American lives and potentially prevented a major international incident. Thorne leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Sloane, do you know how rare you are? A corpsman with legitimate combat skills isn't common, but it's not unique. But someone with your level of medical training, combined with your tactical awareness, your marksmanship, your ability to make life or death decisions under pressure. The Navy has 20,000 corpsmen, maybe 50 who can do what you do at your level. I don't do that anymore, Sloane said firmly. You did 4 days ago. Because I had to, because there was no other choice. And there will be no other choice again, Thorne said, his voice taking on an edge. The world doesn't get safer, Sloane. It gets more complicated, more dangerous. We need people who can navigate that complexity, who can heal when possible and fight when necessary, who understand both sides of that equation. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, laying it on her lap. What's this? Your orders, if you want them. Thorne's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. Report to Naval Special Warfare Center in 3 months after you've completed physical rehabilitation. You'd be assigned as a Special Operations Combat Medic and with full integration training. Work directly with SEAL teams, Marine Raiders, Special Activities units. Use both your skill sets. Save lives and protect those who protect others. Sloane stared at the folder like it was a live snake. I'm a corpsman, she said quietly. That's all I want to be. You're more than that, Thorne countered, and denying it doesn't make it less true. I'm not denying it. I'm choosing. Sloane met his eyes. I choose healing, Admiral. I choose medicine. The fighting that's only when there's absolutely no other choice. And I won't make it my career. I won't make it my identity. Thorne studied her for a long moment. Then he stood adjusting his uniform jacket. Think about it. You have 3 months. The orders will wait. But Sloane, you can't run from what you are forever. Eventually, you'll have to decide who you want to be. He left without another word. Sloane sat in the silence, staring at the folder on her lap. Inside were orders that would define the rest of her life: return to the world she'd fled, embrace the violence she'd sworn to leave behind, become officially what she'd always been afraid she was. She didn't open the folder, just pushed it to the far edge of the bedside table and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she'd deal with it tomorrow. An hour later, another knock. This one softer, respectful. Come in. The door opened and Drummond entered first, his massive frame somehow making the hospital room feel smaller. Behind him came Hollister Mackenzie Brennan, and walking slowly but under his own power, one arm in a complex sling, Lieutenant Nash Merrick. Brennan's face lit up when he saw she was awake. Doc, you look like hell, Sloane finished tiredly. So everyone keeps telling me. I was going to say alive, Brennan said, pulling up a chair with the eagerness of a puppy. You coded twice on the flight here. Both times I did compressions exactly like you taught me. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, repeat. You came back both times. Sloan looked at the young SEAL she'd saved with a needle decompression, who'd returned the favor by keeping her heart beating when it wanted to stop. Thank you, Brennan. Seriously. Merrick stepped forward, moving carefully to protect his damaged shoulder. The sniper who'd been unconscious through most of the fight. Ma'am, he said formally, I wanted to thank you. I'm told you tourniqueted, my shoulder dragged me to safety while under fire, and then continued fighting. The doctors say if you hadn't controlled the bleeding when you did, I would have bled out in less than 10 minutes. Your shooting arm will heal, Merrick said firmly, though Sloan could see the grief in his eyes. Maybe 80% function eventually. I won't be a designated marksman anymore, but I'll adapt. I'll find a new role, because I'm alive to find one, and that's because of you. Hollister stepped forward next, and the cocky medic, who'd questioned everything she did, looked different now. Humbler, more thoughtful, carrying the weight of having seen behind the curtain. Kincaid, he said, I owe you multiple apologies. You don't. I do, Hollister interrupted. I was arrogant, thought I was the best medic in any room I walked into. Thought a volunteer nurse couldn't possibly know more than a Navy-trained SEAL corpsman with advanced trauma certification. And you made me look like a first-year student. The cricothyrotomy, the tactical movement, the shooting under pressure. You're better than me, better than most operators I know, and I'm sorry I doubted you. You didn't know, Sloan said quietly. I should have known, Hollister countered. The signs were all there. I was just too wrapped up in my own ego to see them. Mackenzie, who'd been watching the exchange with his weathered face, kind and understanding, spoke next. What makes you different? Sloan isn't just the skills. Plenty of people have skills. What makes you different is you knew when to use them. You didn't want to fight, you wanted to heal. But when fighting became necessary to protect the people you were healing, you didn't hesitate. Drummond, who'd been silent through all of this, finally stepped forward. I put in a formal request to Naval Special Warfare Command. I want you assigned to my team as our permanent corpsman. We rotate through combat zones every 6 months. Counterterrorism operations training missions, direct action when necessary. You'd save a lot of lives. Sloan looked at each of them. These men she'd bled with, fought beside, nearly died protecting. I'm not coming back to active service. I can't. I know, Drummond said, and the acceptance in his voice made it easier somehow. But the offer stands. You ever change your mind? There's a slot waiting, because you showed us something important, something we needed to see. He pulled the patch from his pocket, the one Mackenzie had shown her before. Corpsman, both hands. We had 20 of these made, Drummond said, laying it on her bed with surprising gentleness for a man his size. One for each member of the medical community we think should see, it should understand what it represents. You're number one on that list, because you showed us that specialization isn't always the answer. That sometimes the best operators are the ones who can do both. Who can heal when possible and fight when necessary. Sloan picked up the patch, running her fingers over the careful stitching. I killed 2 men, maybe more. I don't know how many of my shots in the trauma room were fatal, and I can't stop thinking about it. Can't stop seeing their faces when I close my eyes. Good, Mackenzie said firmly, and when Sloan looked up in surprise, he continued. If you didn't think about it, if it didn't bother you, then you'd be a psychopath. The fact that it weighs on you means you're human. Means you understand what you took from the world. And that weight, that's the price we pay for protecting others. It's heavy. It never gets lighter, but it's worth carrying. My mother hates me for what I did. She's scared, Brennan said, his young face earnest. My mom was the same way when I enlisted. Didn't talk to me for 6 months. But eventually she came around because she realized I was doing something important, something worth the risk. Your mother will too, just give her time. They stayed for another hour telling stories about the mission, about the helicopter extraction, about the debriefs that had lasted for 2 days straight, about how Ashford's lawyer had tried to claim that Sloan had tortured him during the medical procedure, that the cricothyrotomy had been performed maliciously as some kind of revenge. What happened? Sloan asked. I testified that without that procedure, he'd have been dead in under 3 minutes, Hollister said with visible satisfaction. Showed them my own combat medical training records, explained that what you did was textbook emergency airway management. The charges were dropped immediately, but you should have seen his lawyer's face. The man looked genuinely disappointed that he couldn't make you out to be the villain. They laughed real laughter, the kind that came after surviving something terrible together. the kind that help process trauma and build bonds that would last lifetimes. When visiting hours finally ended, they filed out one by one. Brennan shook her hand solemnly, like she was a commanding officer. Hollister saluted, which felt absurd, but also deeply touching. Mackenzie squeezed her shoulder with gentle understanding. Merrick nodded with quiet respect. Drummond was last. He paused at the door, his massive frame backlit by the hallway lights. You get to choose which hand to use, Sloan, but just don't forget you have both. Then they were gone, and Sloan was alone with her thoughts and the patch that somehow captured everything she was struggling to understand about herself. The letter arrived the next morning, hand-delivered by a Navy chaplain who said it had been forwarded through official channels. The envelope was addressed in her mother's handwriting. Sloan opened it with hands that trembled slightly, afraid of what she might find inside. There were two pieces of paper. One was a note from her mother. The other was older, yellowed at the edges, folded carefully. She read her mother's note first. Sloan, I'm sorry for how I reacted on the phone. I was scared. I am still scared. But I've been thinking about what you said about letting people die to keep a promise. Your father kept a journal for most of his adult life. I've never shown it to you because it felt private, like his thoughts were his alone. But there's an entry from 3 months before he died that I think you need to read. I love you. I'm trying to understand. Please give me time. Mom Sloan unfolded the second piece of paper with shaking hands. It was older, much older, the paper itself yellowed with age. The handwriting was her father's strong, confident, the same hand that had signed her birthday cards every year until she was 19. December 15th, 2013. Took Sloan to the range again today. She's 16 now, and she put 5 rounds into a 2-inch group at 600 meters. Didn't even need to adjust her breathing. The kid's a natural. Better than most soldiers I've trained in 20 years of doing this. Barbara's going to kill me if she ever finds out how much time we spend at the range. But I can't help it. The world is dangerous, and it's getting more dangerous every day. My baby girl needs to know how to protect herself, how to protect the people she loves. I don't want her to be a soldier. God, I don't want that. I don't want her to see the things I've seen, to carry the weight I carry. But I want her to have the choice. I want her to have the skills to survive if the world demands it of her. She asked me today why I was teaching her to shoot, if I was teaching her to kill people. I told her no. I'm teaching her to protect people. There's a profound difference. A weapon is just a tool. What matters is the heart that guides it, the intention behind the trigger pull, the soul that decides when violence is necessary and when it's just cruelty. I hope she never needs what I'm teaching her. I pray every night that she'll live a safe, peaceful life, and these skills will just be an interesting hobby, a way we bonded, nothing more. But if she does need them, if the world asks her to be more than just a healer, I hope she remembers that it's not about the violence. It's never about the violence. It's about protecting what you love. It's about standing between the helpless and the cruel. It's about knowing when to heal and when to fight, and having the wisdom to choose correctly. My girl's going to be a warrior, not because she loves fighting, but because she loves protecting. And that's the best kind of warrior. The kind who knows the cost. The kind who fights only when there's no other choice. That's what I'm teaching her. Not to kill, but to protect. And to know the difference. Sloan read the entry 3 times, tears streaming freely down her face. Her father had known, had always known. He'd taught her to shoot not because he wanted her to be a killer, but because he wanted her to be able to protect the people she loved. He'd given her both hands for a reason. One to heal, one to defend. Both essential, both valuable. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the locket alongside his photograph. Closed it, pressed it against her heart. I understand now, Dad, she whispered to the empty room. I finally understand. 6 months later. Morning sun streamed through the windows of Building 164 at Naval Medical Center, San Diego, catching dust motes and making them dance like tiny stars. The sign outside read, Advanced Combat Medicine Training Facility, in crisp military lettering. Senior Chief Sloan Kincaid stood at the front of the classroom looking at 32 faces. Young faces, corpsmen, Army medics, Air Force pararescue jumpers. The next generation of combat medical personnel, here to learn skills that might one day save their lives or the lives of the people they were sworn to protect. Sloan had gained back the 15 pounds she'd lost during the siege at St. Augustine. The dark circles under her eyes had faded with proper sleep and counseling. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, no more disguise, no more hiding. She wore utilities with Senior Chief chevrons on her collar, and the corpsman, both hands patch on her right shoulder. She looked healthy. She looked strong. She looked like herself. All right, people, she said, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone who'd been tested in fire and hadn't broken. Welcome to Integrated Combat Medicine, Week 1. I'm Senior Chief Kincaid, and for the next 12 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to save lives in combat environments, where the enemy doesn't care that you're a medic. A hand went up a young corpsman, maybe 22, with eager eyes. Senior Chief, the course description, said this was different from standard combat medicine training. How so? Sloan smiled slightly, picking up the patch from her desk. Standard combat medicine teaches you to be healers, which is critical, essential, the foundation of everything we do. But in modern warfare and the kinds of asymmetric conflicts we're seeing now, threats don't politely wait for you to finish treating your casualties. You need to be able to defend yourself and your patients. She gestured to the table behind her, which held an unusual combination of equipment, IV kits next to rifles, tourniquets beside ammunition, medical textbooks stacked with tactical manuals. In this course, you're going to learn both skill sets: how to perform a needle decompression while under direct fire, how to establish a secure perimeter around a casualty collection point, how to transition seamlessly from providing medical care to defending yourself and back again. Another hand shot up. Is this teaching us to be shooters, Senior Chief? No, Sloan said firmly. This is teaching you to survive, to bring your patients home alive, and to come home alive yourselves so you can save more lives tomorrow. She pulled up a slide on the projector. A simple quote: heal when you can, fight when you must. The best warriors know the difference. This is our motto, Sloan said. Nazim, medicine first, always medicine first. That's who we are. That's our primary purpose. But when medicine alone isn't enough to protect the people we're trying to save, you need additional tools. That's what we're learning here. A young woman in the back row raised her hand hesitantly. Senior Chief, there are rumors that you were at St. Augustine 6 months ago. Is that true? Sloan had known this question would come eventually. The incident had been classified, but rumors always spread in the tight-knit military medical community. Yes, she said simply. I was there. Is it true you performed a field cricothyrotomy under fire and then engaged multiple hostile forces? Yes to both. The room was silent, waiting. Which was harder? The young woman asked. Sloan considered the question seriously, giving it the thought it deserved. The cricothyrotomy was harder because I had time to think about it, to doubt myself, to consider the consequences. The fighting happened fast, training and muscle memory took over. But the medical procedure, I had to consciously choose to step forward, to reveal skills I'd been hiding, to risk exposure. And in that moment of choice, I had to decide who I was and what I stood for. She paused, making sure she had their complete attention. I chose to save a life, and that led to everything else. The fighting, the chaos, the consequences, all of that came from making that one choice to step forward and be a healer when a life was on the line. And I'd make the same choice again, because that's what we do. We save lives. Everything else is just tools to enable that mission. The classroom absorbed this in silence. Questions about the philosophy of integrated medicine? Sloan asked. When no hands went up, she smiled. Good. Then let's talk about tension pneumothorax. What is it? Why is it immediately fatal if untreated? And how do we manage it in under 60 seconds in a combat environment? The class settled into the familiar rhythm of medical instruction. But every few hours, they would transition, moving from the classroom to the range, from learning IV insertion techniques to learning weapons handling, from discussing hemorrhage control protocols to discussing tactical movement under fire. It was demanding, exhausting, exactly what they needed. During the lunch break, Sloan walked to the memorial wall outside Building 164. Brass plaques lined the concrete, each one engraved with a name and dates. HM1 David Chen, KIA, March 15, 2020, Afghanistan. HM3 Jennifer Miller, KIA, March 15, 2020, Afghanistan. HM2 Michael Santos, KIA, March 15, 2020, Afghanistan. HM1 David Chen, KIA, March 15, 2020, Afghanistan. Her team, her friends, gone 5 years now because of bad intel and worse luck. Sloan touched each plaque gently. I'm teaching them what you taught me, how to save lives, how to survive long enough to save more lives. They're good kids, eager, smart. You'd be proud of them. She'd come here every day for 6 months now. The visits were getting easier, the guilt slowly transforming into something more sustainable. Not gone, never gone, but integrated into who she was instead of defining her completely. I broke my promise to Mom, but I think I kept the one I made to you, to honor your memory by saving more lives, to use what you taught me to protect people. I think Dad would say that's the right choice. Footsteps on gravel, Sloan turned. Barbara Kincaid stood there, 60 years old, with gray threading through her brown hair, but still strong, still proud. She wore civilian clothes and carried her purse in front of her like a shield. They hadn't seen each other in person since before St. Augustine. 6 months of phone calls, of letters, of slowly rebuilding what had been broken. Mom, Sloan said, her voice catching slightly. What are you doing here? Admiral Thorne called me, Barbara said, taking a few hesitant steps closer. Told me about this program you're running. Told me I should come see what you're doing. So I came. You watched through the classroom window. I saw you teaching those young people. Saw the way they looked at you, like you were someone worth listening to, someone worth learning from. Barbara stepped closer, her eyes wet. You're doing what your father wanted. Teaching warriors how to protect people. Not how to kill, but how to save lives while staying alive themselves. I broke the promise I made you, Sloan said quietly, and I'm sorry I asked you to make it. Barbara countered, reaching out to take her daughter's hands. It wasn't fair. I was asking you to cut off half of who you are. Your father gave you both skills for a reason, the healing and the fighting. Both matter. Both have their place. I was wrong to ask you to choose between them. They stood together by the memorial wall, mother and daughter finally understanding each other after 6 months of painful growth. Your father would be so proud of you, Barbara whispered. You think so? I know so. Not because you can shoot, not because you can fight, but because you know when to do each. Because you choose healing first always, and only fight when there's no other choice. Barbara squeezed her daughter's hands. That's exactly what he wanted for you. Sloan's radio crackled. Senior Chief Kincaid, your 1300 class is waiting. Sloan keyed the mic. Copy, on my way. She looked at her mother. Want to stay watch the afternoon session? Barbara smiled through her tears. I'd like that very much. They walked back to building 164 together, and for the first time in 6 months, maybe for the first time in 5 years, Sloan felt at peace with who she was and what she'd become. The afternoon session was weapons manipulation and tactical medicine integration. Sloan demonstrated how to maintain security while treating a casualty, how to work as a fire team to protect wounded while continuing the mission, how to transition smoothly between roles. Barbara watched from the observation gallery, seeing her daughter move with confidence and competence, seeing the students absorb every word like gospel. This was who Sloan was meant to be, not just a healer, not just a warrior, but both. Integrated. Whole. When class ended, Sloan found her mother waiting in the hallway. Thank you for coming, Sloan said. Thank you for letting me see this, for letting me understand. Barbara touched her daughter's face with gentle hands. You look happy, really happy for the first time in years. I'm getting there. It's a process. Therapy helps, teaching helps, but mostly knowing I'm making a real difference, that helps most of all. They walked outside into the California sunshine. The Pacific Ocean was visible in the distance, endless and blue. Are you going back, Barbara asked, to combat deployments? Sloan pulled out her phone, showed her mother a text from Drummond she'd received that morning. Team deploying to Romania next month. Training mission with their SOF. Low threat, high value. 3 months. Slots open if you want it. I don't know yet, Sloan admitted. Part of me wants to use everything I know in the field, wants to save lives in real time. But another part thinks I can do more good here training in the next generation. What does your heart tell you? Sloan thought about it, really considered the question. My heart says I'm a corpsman first, whether I'm in a classroom or a combat zone, and corpsmen go where they're needed most. Her phone rang. Drummond. Barbara nodded. Take it. I'll wait, Sloan answered. Drummond. Kincaid, got a proposal for you. I'm listening. 3-month rotation to Romania. Medical support for joint training with their special forces. Low intensity, high teaching value. You'd be running medical clinics for local civilians during downtime, teaching integrated combat medicine to their medics during training cycles. Best of both worlds, field work and teaching. What do you think? Sloan looked at the ocean, at her students heading to their barracks, at her mother watching with patient understanding. Can I think about it? Give you an answer in 48 hours. Take your time, Senior Chief. We don't ship out for 3 weeks. Offer stands until then. He hung up. Sloan stood there in the San Diego sunshine, feeling the weight of the decision but not crushed by it. Field work meant risk, meant potentially having to fight again. But it also meant saving lives in real time, meant teaching while doing, meant using both hands. What are you going to do? Barbara asked gently. I honestly don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. And whatever I choose, it'll be my choice. Not made from fear or guilt or trying to be someone I'm not. They walked to the parking lot together. Come to dinner tonight, Barbara said. I'm in town for 2 more days. I want real time with you. Time to talk about your father, about the future, about everything. I'd love that, Mom. They embraced tighter than they had in years with real warmth and understanding. I love you, Barbara said, on all of you, the healer and the warrior and the teacher and my daughter. All of it. I love you too, Mom. Barbara drove away and Sloan stood in the parking lot watching until the car disappeared from sight. Her phone buzzed, a text from one of her students. Senior Chief question about tourniquet placement in unconventional body positions. When you have a minute, can we discuss? Sloan smiled and started typing a response. This was her life now, teaching mentoring, preparing the next generation to face the impossible choices she'd faced, and maybe occasionally going back to the field herself when the mission and the need aligned, using both hands when needed. She looked down at her hands, still steady, still capable. One hand held her phone, answering students' questions, building the future. The other rested on the patch on her shoulder, Courseman. Both hands. Her father had been right. A weapon was just a tool. What mattered was the heart guiding it. And her heart, it had finally found its balance. 2 days later, Sloan called Drummond. I'm in. 3 months in Romania, then back to teaching. Outstanding. Welcome back to the operational world, Senior Chief. She hung up and looked at the patch on her desk, the symbol of everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. Heal when you can, fight when you must. Know the difference. Senior Chief Sloan Kincaid. Corpsman. Teacher. Warrior. Healer. Daughter. All of these things. Both hands raised in service to something larger than herself. Both skills honed not for violence but for protection. Both parts of herself finally completely integrated into one whole person. The warrior and the healer weren't separate anymore. They never had been. They were two aspects of the same calling, two tools in the same mission. Save lives, protect the innocent, come home, teach others, repeat. That was the job. That was the purpose. And Sloan Kincaid was finally truly at peace with both hands.